We have a saying, I'd rather be the worst innovator than the best imitator. We like originality. And so our culture is stamped with that. And so that is the ethos of the African in America. And it makes us unique in the world. And it leads me to call this culture we created New African, meaning we drew from fundamental African principles. There's a whole lot. I'm not going into any of them today, but the most fundamental being spirit, extended family, humanism, those being extremely important, and freedom. And freedom becomes much more important and becomes important for all Africans in the Western Hemisphere and as they come under colonialism in Africa. But for the African in America, it's the hallmark of our creative expression. It is our way to express our freedom. And so every time we make a move that represents a new departure, whether it's in the art form or in the politics, we always go back to improvisation and innovation. That is our way of expressing our freedom. And so this is a unique, distinct quality of the African American. And if we are to understand Ethiopianism and Pan-Africanism, we have to understand that it comes out of the birth pangs for the African in America of a new peoplehood. And that's a new African peoplehood. You can call it Black, you can call it African American, but it is the unique flavor that you bring to the world. In whatever you do, that's us. You got to be original. You hear what I'm talking about? This is the heart of your nature. It's the heart of your ethos. It's the heart of your essence. And I don't hear too many people saying this because I study you. You're my first study. I study Africa, but I even study us a little bit more because you can't apply the past unless you apply it to yourself and to your present. And what we've created here, as W.B. Du Bois said, it's the most beautiful culture this side of heaven. You hear me? And when God sees this culture expressed on a high level, God has to sit up in heaven and smile. And so when we're looking at Ethiopianism and Pan-Africanism, it comes out of, for the African America, this bent towards creativity. And the African and the Caribbean also comes up with this new edition, Pan-Africanism. And we share that in common, but we have to create a culture in a different way, undercover, right under the nose of our oppressors. We pull off creating a culture and an art form. And the European has no art form indigenous to this country. And we come up with another mantra that's real key to African Americans. I've mentioned this before, to bring beauty where there's ugliness. And Ethiopianism and Pan-Africanism were two expressions of beauty, but it inspires the whole culture. I've mentioned George Washington Carver before. His science was inspired by that. Our singers, it's inspired by that. A Martin Luther King in a speech is inspired by that. The anti-apartheid movements or the Black Lives Matter movements are inspired by that. You hear me? Beauty in a sea of ugliness, you know? But that is particularly the quality of this new Africa. And one of the things that I think God probably enjoys most in God's creations is God gives us life and free will. But then, as some great spiritualists have said, probably what God gets out of the bargain is what's new that we bring in, that's good, you know? And it's not just us, all of humanity. Whatever God's able to draw from, any part of the human family tree that's good and beautiful, God delights in that, you know? And I think that's true because that's the nature of free will. And so Ethiopianism and Pan-Africanism have that characteristic. Now, while enslaved Africans in the United States were not Christians, they, along with their few Christian brothers and sisters, in forging this new African culture, introduced new principles that were necessary for our survival. So we drew on deep African principles that guide us, that are our soul, some conscious, some unconscious. But we also created new expressions, and these new expressions were necessary for our survival here. And the most important of these new expressions for the African in the United States is race consciousness. Without race consciousness, no Garvey movement. A movement that couldn't start in the Caribbean because in Jamaica, because the Africans in Jamaica did not have this race consciousness that they didn't need. They weren't hanging from a tree. You know, they didn't have white people running every day, apartheid on them. You know what I mean? They were a majority on their island, and they were under British colonial rule. And as one sister who was working in Las Vegas years ago, she was cleaning up rooms and stuff. So I always like to talk and ask people questions. So I asked her, I said, Garvey said it was trouble getting this movement off the ground in Jamaica. And I said, why was that? She said, the British have a way of telling you to go to hell so nicely that they get you to look forward to the trip. A lot of Blacks from this country are fooled by the British because they'll go into Britain and maybe somebody will help them with their luggage. It happens to be a white person. In the United States, they'd be putting that luggage upside your head. And so they suddenly think, oh, these are nicer people. Or the cops aren't shooting you all the time because a lot of them don't have guns, but they'll hit you upside the head with one of those billy clubs, you know? But the British have cultivated through a colonial tradition of 300 years among their ruling class, this arrogant niceness. When they're going to do you in, they'll always give it a label that'll sound good, you know? So, but in the United States, as we forged our culture, one of the things that was the most important in forging the culture was the realization that what we had foremost in common, that was really also why we were oppressed, was the color of our skin. And we understood that the racism coming from whites dictated their behavior in terms of oppressing Blacks. So race consciousness was this consciousness that we as a people caught hell because of the color of our skin. And some people now, some including some of our scholars, would like to eliminate this thing, race consciousness, because they don't see it as African. It's new African, and it's a reality that binds you together. This younger generation, whatever shifts have occurred in culture because of the external forces that hit Black communities since '68, the young generation is race conscious, and in some ways that the older generation isn't. They are really race conscious on prisons. They are really race conscious on police because they face them every day. And so they've launched a movement around that, Black Lives Matter. But race consciousness isn't just the consciousness that you catch hell because of the color of your skin, it's race pride. It's the pride in being Black. And I'm gonna just give you a side story on Garvey. Garvey nearly missed out in building a movement in the United States because he didn't really understand race consciousness. He had come from the Maroons, so he had some pride in Blackness, but it wasn't based on race consciousness. And it's only when he attends a meeting held by Hubert Harrison, who was one of the most brilliant intellectuals coming out of the Caribbean in the United States. And it's at that meeting that because he's ready to leave, because he had been trying to organize in the United States, And it's at that meeting he comes in contact with what many called, and King in the 60s and the 50s in the Montgomery bus boycott would call the new Negro. It was the awakened African coming back from World War I angry because they had been told by Du Bois and others that if they fought in this war, they'd make the world safe for democracy and everything would be better. In the end, bloody summers, and blacks were fighting back. Whites were coming back. They wanted their jobs back. Their blacks were occupying neighborhoods they had lived in. And so they, had bloody summers where they were out here killing blacks. Blacks fought back. They had been armed in World War I. They knew how to fight. But Garvey became acquainted with race consciousness. And he began to see the world through the lens of race. And when he did that, along with his anti-war stance, his movement took off the ground. So what you got to understand is race consciousness is the shell of New African culture. It's not the substance. And that's what a lot of people miss, some of whom want to say that they don't really want to deal with this race consciousness anymore. Some of our scholars, what they're missing is it's the shell for a new African culture that resides within it. And of course, African-American culture, what you call Black culture, has a spectrum from an Ella Baker, who was extremely conscious and later becomes also African and revolutionary, to some who are in bad shape. It depends on what part of the spectrum you're in, but that's true of all cultures. African-American or New African culture is complex. I'm not getting into that today. Today it's Pan-Africanism and Ethiopianism. So race consciousness is important because it not only enables us to see that we catch hell because we're Black, but race consciousness enables us to also begin to see Africa as one. It's part of this identification process that identifies Blackness with Africa, and Africa is one. Race consciousness contributes to that. It is a part of us forming a sense of peoplehood. Now, Africans in Africa also had race consciousness, but in a different way. Their race consciousness was usually coming from those who had been exposed to the colonial system and who had undergone miseducation through the missionary system. And they become conscious of racism, and they become race conscious, and then they begin to look beyond their borders where they're colonized and what today is called Nigeria or Ghana or whatever. And so there's a race consciousness, but it is not a consciousness that seeps into the masses of African people who are still living traditional lives undergoing change. And so what happens here is the African here in the United States is more race conscious because of the racism, and more race conscious than those in the Caribbean because they haven't had the presence of whites on them all the time. But when they get into this reality, when an African from the Caribbean comes to the United States or comes to Britain or any place, France, any place where whites are ruling, then they get exposed to racism. And then they begin to undergo a transformation that their children especially will experience. So race consciousness becomes a key new element in New African culture that contributes to what becomes New African culture, and particularly Pan-Africanism, which is one of the brightest new jewels that Africans create, not only here, but in the Caribbean, and then export to Africa. And it becomes key to our survival and to our progress.